Chapter 33. From the swarm of goblins emerged after a while an Ashlesian, looking like a general. David expected to see someone less impressive. An incredibly handsome Ashlesian wore a helmet similar to what conquistadors once wore in David's world. It was commonly called Morian, but this one, to the point of exaggeration, was decorated with jewels, and the face was covered with additional covers for the cheeks. He also wore a blue robe and plate armor on his muscular body, and in his hand he held a diamond saber, similar to the one the boy had found in the river. The man did not have a shield, but he had a buckler attached to his hand with a blue outline of the eye painted on a white background. The pupil of the eye, of course, represented the rudder of the ship, and the whole eye must have been also the coat of arms of these dignified pirates. Quintus eris tu senvinel? The Ashlesian finally asked the second question. He asked Spheo. Bago suddenly said to his friends. How do you know that? How do you know Ashlesian? Celian was surprised. Bago TVE best les school, TVE best doctal, TVE best desloyal, TVE best thinkle, Bago and the best languages expert perhaps, replied Muddy with a serious face, as almost always, and then turned to the pirate at the bottom. Samasteris servantiers, Sonoria, T tremus fine yaegu pelos esclavalis. Everyone who heard this, even David, could not believe their ears. Could it be that Bago communicated more correctly in Ashlesian? I told him Tvat the hat blort him vine and that'll fall TVE slaves, informed the skinny guy his comrades. Meanwhile, the Ashlesian general spoke again. No envies in Nadlil poor Vinel, no cremulament vistat Nucia. David, hearing these words, think that the language reminded him a little of Spanish, although he had never learned that language. He says Tvat he didn't send anyone full vine and he doesn't lean off us. Bago continued to translate and explain quietly, so that no one but his friends could hear him say anything. So tell them Bago that we're sorry and that we're really Athenestians. Celian replied. That's wrote the hearing mudman, wanting to think that something had only overheard him. Trust me, my friend, and so sooner or later they would see who we really are, the scout reassured him. Yes put it is stupid. The skinny Muddy began to speak louder and louder, which alarmed the Ashlesian standing in the pit. He pulled out from behind his backs the long arquebus, a wooden firearm used by some of the great pirates. It was one of the first weapons of its kind and was very hard to use, but when it fired, it was able to sow real destruction and deep wounds. The Ashlesian commander lifted his deadly weapon up to whittle down the suspicious guests, but after a while they calmed down. The Ashlesian, however, still kept his weapon at the ready and pointed his gun at the mudman, which had just stepped forward to tell him something. Bago took air into his lungs and then hesitantly conveyed his message to the pirate. Pedensis por loque digo, pero, angry audices sumus Athenestians, por favor, habel saber la opportunis dix flicer mesta situationersa. Hearing this, an Ashlesian trembled, puzzled. He heard from the newcomer that they were apologizing and admitting that they were Athenestians. He was also surprised that this skinny man in a hat could communicate in his language as if he were one of them. He thought for a moment that maybe they were actually only bringing wine as slaves, but he had just noticed that they had weapons with them. The pirate, however, as a wise general, has not yet killed the suspects, as most of his tribesmen did it. He just wanted to know even more about these strange individuals. Besides, the one who had just spoken to him, Muddy, asked him at the end for the opportunity to explain this extremely strange situation. Comia pudia esta sigurodi flarentes? Asked the Ashlesian, trying to be as calm as possible. Bago again translated the pirate's words to his comrades. Hve asks how confident he can be to trust us. Celian strangely took on a strange expression when he heard this. Tell him that he can't trust us and let him plug his ears, the scout replied. David and Bago, not knowing what the comrade meant, thought that he must have suddenly gone crazy. Tereferdin frowned, and Terhin let out a strange groan of misunderstanding. Only Jellyf asked him calmly, but what do you mean, Celian? I mean, this, the scout replied to her, and then he pulled dynamite from behind the coat. David had his eyes wide open. I bought one in Utal. I knew it might come in handy one day. When he said this, he exposed it from a dirty bag and lifted it upwards. An Ashlesian still standing down, was surprised to see a hooded man lifting an unknown red thing, and later his companions began to yell at him. What are you doing? Don't do it, they screamed. The Ashlesian, of course, did not understand their speech, but he had just obtained proof that these newcomers must certainly be Ephinastians, so he aimed arquebus at the scout. He wasn't sure whether to shoot yet, but the behavior of the intruders spoke for itself. So they must be spies, thought Mertens, taking off the safety of his gun. However, he saw that the scout upstairs was also doing something. It wasn't until Cillian lit dynamite with flint, which he rubbed uncover over the fuse of his weapon, that the pirate reacted and learned what the red thing was, so the commander pulled the trigger. Now he had no reason to be composed and he wanted to kill the insidious intruders who turned out to be enemies. The bullet pierced the air, pushing behind it a pall of smoke thrown through a powerful barrel. The bullet, however, did not hit the scout, but Muddy, the pirate, dissatisfied with the inaccurate shot, was going to reload the weapon again, but at the same moment the barrels filled with water were already falling down the stairs with the dynamite. When Bago fell to the ground, wounded in the arm, at the same moment the wooden barrels began to shatter against the steps of the stairs. Then Mertens heard a loud bang of dynamite exploding. All 6 wooden objects were blown up, which resulted in tens of liters of water falling on the swarm of goblins. Monsters were treated with wooden pieces of shards and splinters, which injured and even crashed into some of them, and then a wave of water fell on them. Mertens shielded himself from the rain of blown-up boards with his buckler, but after a while something stuck in his leg. A metal hoop, which was a reinforcement for the barrel, stuck into his thigh, piercing his right leg. The Ashlesian felt like an ending. A twisted, sharp metal is driven into his body and stops only until his bone. He screamed in pain, not believing his own eyes. After a while, he fell without strength, and the monsters squirked and thrashed around in the wet ground, screaming in suffering, for they had just been doused with something they hated above all else. Some of the monsters that had been completely doused had such a frenzy that they began to run in all directions and even throw themselves on the palisade to shorten their torment. Some ran on it, while others ran on, not knowing what to do with their wet bodies. They stumbled over other monsters lying wounded on the ground. David, who together with his companions threw the barrels down the stairs, could not believe the destruction they had done. He watched in horror at the goblins screaming in agony, which were literally dying from the water itself. Their skin began to peel off, as if water were the worst plague for them. He didn't think that monsters hated that thing to such an extent, and that's how it impacted for them. Despite this pitiful sight, David felt no pity for the evil monsters who had no feelings or good in themselves. But when he saw the Ashlesian commander screaming in pain, he felt bad at the thought that he was a tender in this insidious trap. Bago, what happened? Did he shoot you? TWOU cried out suddenly, terrified, seeing a mudman rested against the wall, holding on to the bleeding wound. Nothing wrong, I'm fine, Bago replied calmly. You're fine. After all, I see your state, the boy cried. Tears appeared in his eyes. Quickly, I'm not going to die, my friend. The skinny man comforted him, revealing his right shoulder. Look. They're mudmans, they have held skin. TWOU bullet barely hit me, Bago replied, smiling at the boy. TWOU, however, was not stupid. It is true that the mudmans actually have a durable body, and the Bago's wound was not deep, but the boy did not pay attention to it. He saw that shrapnels had slinged all over the wound. The mudman's entire hand hung stiff-limbly and became visibly pale. Despite Bago's grey skin, only the fingers of the Muddy moved until they too were paralyzed. The boy, in tears, covered his friend's wound again with his hands, unable to look at it anymore. This damned pirate will pay for it, Cillian shouts suddenly, seeing a wounded mudman and TWOU crying. When he said this, he grabbed a bow to shoot at the Ashlesian general. He turned around, and when he did it, he couldn't believe his eyes. He saw David approaching the pirate, pulling bandages and Nensif herb from his bag to ease the victim's pain. What is he doing? He was surprised, then moved towards the boy. He went down the stairs and entered the courtyard. What are you doing, David? Do not help this sea dog. Do not waste these dressings on him. Cillian angrily shouted to David. Embarrassed, the boy tossed the bandages to the ground. Iadronis, Ibardonis, Mertens suddenly spoke angrily to the scout. I don't understand you. Come back, better plunderer, to the sea and drown there. Cillian cried furiously with tears in his eyes, and then he grabbed a goblin spear to kill the pirate. Come to your senses, Cillian. What are you doing? David shouted. I will kill you just as you and your treacherous tribe kills. I will kill you just as you killed my master's family. I will kill you and burn your body just as you did to his loved ones. Serema will be grateful to me. In the end, I will avenge his wife and children and my grandfather's death," began to shout to the pirate Celian, no longer controlling himself. "Celian, you are probably no longer yourself. Come to your senses. After all, you are not a murderer. Revenge will not help here." David began to scream, trying to stop the scout who wanted to stab the pirate with a spear, straight in the chest. "As a commander, I command you to embrace yourself, Celian. What happened to your head at all? Nanthornan told you to listen to me, so come to your senses." The boy began to worry, for the first time seeing a friend in such a state. A cheerful, young scout, in an instant he turned into someone completely different entirely. There was such hatred in his eyes that David began to be quite afraid. After a while, he pushed Celian away from the wounded pirate. When he did, the scout suddenly grabbed David by the hood and pulled his knife out from behind his belt. "What happened to you, Celian?" David asked, terrified, seeing his own friend putting a sharp blade to his neck. The boy was completely shocked. "Celian, please stop," David cried in a terrified, trembling voice. The other comrades, busy inspecting the wounded Bago, did not even know what was happening. David began to shake. Never before had something so terrible and surprising happened to him. "Chicus," the pirate called to Celian, wanting to tell him to leave the boy. The scout, however, did not hear him at all. He stared only at David, even with an abnormal look. The boy had the impression that the scout's eyes were slowly becoming all black. At first he thought that something is not real there and that the whole situation is just a terrible nightmare, but Celian's beautiful eyes were really covered into some darkness, something that David couldn't comprehend at all. After a while, the boy also noticed that from Celian's face wet with water, the skin began to peel off. David wept as he saw his close friend slowly turn into a completely different person, that he transforms into a monster. Suddenly, he also heard someone's scream behind him. Jelif began to scream in terror, closing her eyes, pointing something to her companions. Bago and his caretakers looked up. David also looked in the direction where the terrified woman was pointing. Celian also looked in that direction, but a disgusting smile showed on his face. Tirefadin, standing at the top of the stairs, let out a desperate moan and fell to the ground, unable to even draw air into his lungs. David, who was suddenly struck by a breath of icy wind, in an instant he began to regret that he was in this place. In their direction, a figure known to them was approaching, slowly, but that figure looked much different than always. The masked person was further approaching the 7 terrified figures. "No," David shouted, unable to come to terms with what his eyes were seeing. Celian still held his knife to his throat, and only he did not seem frightened. Mirentagan approached the assailable David and laughed. David clenched his eyes as he saw the smiling mask of the mysterious ruler. "Hello, my friend, I was waiting for you," Mirentagan said to the terrified boy. After a while, David felt his hand begin to pat him on the head. He then had such a thrill that in an instant he became wet with sweat all over his body, and his bladder began to literally hurt him. "Leave me alone," the boy groaned quietly. "Why, Davy? After all, friends do not leave themselves in need, and it just so happens that I need your help, boy." "Nope. No, no, shut up, you devilish possessed psycho. What did you do with Celian? What do you want from us?" David cried. "What do I want?" "That's a very good question, boy," Mirentagan replied. "I just want you to tell me something, my friend, and you will save your companion," replied the evil ruler, pointing to Celian. "Speak then," David screamed, in a broken voice. "I want to know, Davy, what you're doing in this world. Please tell me why you came here," the evil ruler replied. The boy, hearing this, broke down. I myself do not know what I am doing here. How do you know I'm not of this world? Who are you?" David began to cry. "How's that?" "Don't you know, I'm your friend, your angel. I have always been with you and have never left you in this messy world of yours." The boy twitched. Only now has he realized that he had been hearing his voice for years. He was reminded again of the evil voice in his head as he fought with Selith. "I know, Dave, that deep inside you want me. You cover my voice when you feel shabbily. That's the way it is. You wanted me because I gave you comfort, boy. I gave you light. I know very well that more than once you have had a desire for this wonderful hatred, just like your dear friend Celian. You wanted to beat Max for what he was doing to you. You wanted to kill your parents for how they kicked you out. They threw you away like garbage because they thought you were just a snotty toddler, dirty cloth that should be discarded. I know you want to get that piece of me, you want solace for your lost soul. Every human wants it. After all, you know that people desire and covet this beautiful power. So follow me and I will give you power over every human garbage that has ever destroyed your life. Mirentagan started screaming. For David, every word was a painful blow. Leave him alone, you devil. Tirefadin suddenly cried out towards Mirentagan. Oh, and who do we have here? Ah, yes, it's you, Tirefadin, a cheap traitor, laughed the ruler. I am no longer your slave. Tirefadin cried out. Is it? You can all be my slaves as soon as my lord allows it. Everyone is able to love me, Mirentagan shouted. David took the opportunity to glance surreptitiously at his sword. Then he looked at Mirentagan again, and when he found that he no longer paid attention to him, he took up arms. He pushed the possessed Celian away from himself and he attacked the evil ruler, but the man supernaturally turned toward him and grabbed the blade of the sword, as if he had eyes on the back of his head. Pitch black blood flooded his whole hand, penetrating and disappearing into his black glove. Do you really think I can just be killed? After all, I'm not even here. This whole world doesn't really exist. This Nanthorin of yours only abuses you. He forces you to fulfill his stupid missions and various whims. Mirentagan screamed. David, however, no longer paid attention to him. The sword he was holding in his hand suddenly lightened with a white light. The blade now resembled a motionless, white fire, on which after a while the inscription appeared, "Do not lose faith and overcome evil with good." The boy remembered immediately when he saw this polished text for the first time. He smiled in his spirit, remembering the good moments he spent with friends in the Eternal Camp, ridiculously the adventures he experienced there. Then he remembered the goofy Celian who had saved him from the forest bearers he trained to fight with Metkul, Turgeon and Nanthorin, Serema, who in his heart was actually a funny philosopher and inventor, the Selnovit doctor and his tent clinic, and the serious Bago whose every word made him happy. He also remembered the beautiful, colorful forests he encountered in this beautiful world. He remembered how he and his companions rode horses over clean rivers, wastelands, picturesque meadows and great mountains. Then he also remembered the times when he was still at home, beautiful Esther and her wonderful hair smelling of flowers, and Michael and Dorothy, who took him in and called him a son after only a few days. He even returned to his deepest memories when he was still a little boy raising in an orphanage. He remembered the birds that sung there every day, among the trees, their morning song outside the window when he woke up. The boy remembered all those joyful moments when he had joy in his heart, and although sometimes there were unpleasant and painful moments, he already knew that it was all beautiful. He suddenly realized that life had meaning. He already knew why Nanthorin had taken him to this world. This mysterious warrior wanted the boy to know friendship, cooperation, simple love and joy, simple life and adventure. He wanted him to know that he had the soul of a warrior in him, a warrior who will guard and fight for what is good. And if evil wants to destroy this world, it means that it will also destroy me and my friends. Then my all good memories and all human memories of joy will disappear, David said in his mind, then looked straight into Mirentagan's face again. Get stuffed better with the shit from which you came from, demon. Go back to where you came from. I reject you and you have no access to me. The only thing you can give me is darkness and a lie, shouted the boy. Tears appeared in his eyes again. Celian, who had already risen from the ground, was still aiming at him from the bow, and Mirentagan laughed when he heard an angry David. Do you see your anger, Davy? Even now you want me, even now you want to hate, mocked Mirentagan. Evil must be hated, evil is the only thing that needs to be destroyed, David shouted. Mirentagan laughed again as he saw the boy trying to reach him with his sword. I can't just be rejected or killed. To do this, you must first do it with yourself. Mirentagan laughed. Nope. To kill evil you have to create good. You have to create good and kill the mess darkness you want to give me. David began to scream. In an instant, various thoughts flowed through his head. The boy realized that evil creates darkness at the hands of man himself, and only this man can rebel against this evil. I'll kill the darkness. I used to think that every evil person should be killed. I thought the world would be better without them, but it doesn't have to be. To stop the darkness, one should not get rid of evil ones but evil. One should not get rid of murderers, but murder. One should not get rid of persecutors, but persecution. No God was responsible for my suffering. Max and my parents were not responsible. Only you are responsible for my suffering. You will pay me for what you have done to me, you possessed devil. You will pay me for how you destroyed Celian, Max and my whole family, whoever you are. I'm no longer afraid of you. To kill the darkness you have to create light. When the boy said this, his sword shone with an even stronger, luminous glow. Mirentagan drew attention to his weapon, which began to move slowly, and bite the evil ruler in the hand. Mirentagan, however, had no intention of giving up. He grabbed the blade with his other hand, and black blood gushed from his wound. David also had no intention of giving up. Suddenly, some indescribable power penetrated his entire body. "I'll kill you," the boy screamed. Then he began to shout like a berserker, and he pushed the sword forward. Mirentagan's hands have slipped off the blade of the weapon, and David stabbed the monster right in the chest. He recessed the sword and pierced the Dark Knight's belly through. "Shoot him!" Mirentagan suddenly yelled to the blinded Celian. David, however, jumped to the side, and the arrow released by the scout stuck in the ruler's neck. Mirentagan began to spit black blood. On his mask, however, a demonic smile appeared again. "Not bad," he mumbled, after which he began to choke. "You're not going to kill me anyway. I can't die. I can't do that activity." Mirentagan laughed, then snatched an arrow from his body and drove it into the side of his head. "You can't kill me with any fool's blade," he shouted, laughing. David, however, no longer listened to the monster. He guessed what Mirentagan's weak point must be. An open mouth and the mask of an evil ruler must have been that place. As he opened them, an impenetrable darkness appeared in it. "I'll shut your mouth better," David cried out, throwing himself at the apparition. "You can't kill me, goofball. I'm not really here. This whole world is just a product of your vivid imagination. No mortal can kill me. If you kill my body, I'll come back anyway. I will always be with you. You will carry me in your heart forever, for everyone desires it. Every man loves all sin. People love darkness. It gives them solace and relief before the dazzling light that is the truth. They know that light cannot exist without darkness. Everyone must taste this beauty, no demon. This dazzling light, which is the truth, can sometimes be painful, but I prefer to walk in the light than in the darkness, and this is because in the light you can see your fall, your sin and your weaknesses, but you can see your destiny, and in the darkness, nothing can be seen. You don't see your fall, you don't see your sin or your weaknesses, but you also don't see that you yourself are behind this darkness," David shouted. Mirentagan laughed again. "Do you think that these words of yours make any impression on me? No, every human mortal must know that it was my Lord who became the God of men. Only he has the power to give you people a soothing relief." Mirentagan did not finish his speech, because suddenly something knocked him off his feet. Meddens lying on the ground knocked him with a healthy leg, which caused the evil ruler to fall over. So David jumped to the enemy as soon as possible, raised his fiery sword upwards, and drove it straight into the lying mouth. The demon began to yell out. His mouth opened several times and various mysterious noises began to come out of them. Demonic screams began to intensify. The boy had the impression that he was beginning to hear his own voice, sad words that he once said himself. "Remember that I am your voice, your thoughts, your angel." Mirentagan started screaming despite his clogged throat. After a while, the entire body of the monster literally exploded. David flew a few meters up, thrown out by a blast of some black explosion. After a while, he collapsed to the ground, falling with a wail on his back, and his luminous sword landed next to him, after which it again took on its former appearance, and dazed David looked at the place where Mirentagan had just been lying. The boy noticed that only the purple robe of the monster was lying on the ground, so he barely got up from the ground, on bending legs, and when he did it, something happened that he did not expect at all. The purple robe rose a few meters up and began to move like a living being. After a while, the material transformed into a purple figure, which flew away after a while, further upwards. After a while, it dissolved into the air, turning into purple smoke. Immediately afterwards, however, the smoke also disappeared without a trace, and finally the air suddenly pierced demonic laughter. "What happened?" someone's voice suddenly said. David turned around in fear, but when he saw who was standing in front of him, he burst into tears. He threw his arms wide open around Celian's neck and hugged him tightly, even though he was much shorter than the scout. "I thought you were done. You don't even know how scared I was. I thought you would remain that monster." The boy began to sob, hanging still on his friend's neck, forgetting in an instant about all what had just happened. "But what's the point? What happened to me?" Have I weakened, or what? Suddenly, there was darkness, and then suddenly I woke up standing on my feet, said the scout. His behavior indicated that he actually did not remember anything, or even saw nothing. How good it is to see that you are yourself again, that funny scout, jumping on the roofs of houses. David began to cry further. Calm down, David. I guess it wasn't so bad to call me a monster now. What happened then? Asked the scout calmly. That's good that you didn't see anything, my friend. It was terrible. It was. David groaned further. What? Asked the scout, not knowing what was going on. The boy looked hesitantly at Celian, then mumbled quietly. He was here, Mirentagon, he was here. Celian was terrified, not knowing what to think about it all. David. Celian, are you okay? Sorry I couldn't do anything. I was afraid to help you. I didn't even want to look, and something didn't even allow me to do that. Jelif suddenly began to call, running down the stairs. Where is he now? She added after a while, terrified. He just disappeared, David replied quietly. And was that Mirentagon? He looked like a ghost. I didn't even saw anything. I was afraid to look. I didn't even heard what he was saying. Something plugged my ears. The terrified woman began to cry out. The others were equally terrified. I hope never to meet him again, Turhin shouted, crying in the arms of the wounded mudman. Tirefadin standing next to him tried to breathe calmly, but when he saw again the lord whom he had once served, he shook like jelly and barely breathed, remembering his terrible words, for he was given the best to hear his words, unlike the others. David, on the other hand, suddenly let go of Celian's neck. The scout at first simply thought that David had stopped hugging him, but the boy fell limply to the ground. Terrified Celian leaned across over a weakened David, whom everything began haze over before his eyes. After a while, the young man fainted completely, and everything he had just seen blurred from his memory as soon as the boy was overcome by impenetrable murk darkness and silence from everywhere. Chapter 34. Metans, limping, walked on, leading 6 Athenestians behind him. Porquetnazaudas, Bago asked him why he was helping them. Estoitanos sustadas como tau, quirus salidi est malditus agugero, replied the Esletian. Hvzazes scaldus veil and vance to get out of this damned place, translated muddy to comrades. Half-conscious, David, dragging himself at the very end, mumbled something carelessly and quietly, as if his whole life had come out of him. He remembered almost nothing and found it difficult for him to say anything. He and the others felt shabbily to see the wounded pirate. Supported from the side, by Tirefadin. Los Antimosa, Bago said remorselessly to the pirate, asking for forgiveness. Mudman, however, was not sure whether the Esletian would forgive them something so harsh and insidious. He may indeed cooperate with them, but he did not think that the pirate was doing it out of friendship, but simply out of the most usual coercion. If he really wants to get out of this horrible place, he will unfortunately have to cooperate with his enemy, whether he likes it or not, and so he preferred the company of a human enemy to continue cooperating with those stupid monsters who literally spit and squealed under his feet. The pirate was actually grateful that these mysterious newcomers had spared him, but he had no desire to speak to them, and so no one but the injured mudman would understand him. Bago looked at his bandaged arm and then at the pirate's stitched wound. He smiled at him, as if to apologize, but the Esletian only gave him an angry look. David was still staring, every now and then, at the beautiful buildings of the capital and the indescribable huge houses, reaching up to 12 floors up, but there was no admiration or anything like that in his eyes. The city was ruined, and these beautiful, colorful buildings, absorbed in the darkness of the night, could no longer convey this beauty as they once had. David looked at the houses sad, frightened, and couldn't even remember what he was doing here. Of course, the boy remembered a lot as soon as he woke up from a several minute coma, but still, even what he saw, now seemed to him as if foggy. He thought that at any moment, behind an alley, there might be some danger waiting for them, so the boy looked around, here and there, thinking only about getting out of this sinister place as soon as possible. It didn't even occur to the boy that this city was once bustling with real, carefree life. Various alleys, stalls, tenement houses, shops, workshops, which until recently were filled to the brim with happy people, were now quite deserted, not counting the bodies of unfortunate people left around. There was only an ominous silence all around him, which was so terrible to David that he feared his own breath. He was also afraid to stay behind, because it was not excluded that suddenly something would surprise him from behind, clog his mouth, and kill unexpectedly. These were all just the boy's fears, but he wasn't the only one who thought it was a possible case. David was literally in some kind of horror, and the night sky covered with clouds and a quiet wind only reinforced this impression and made his body shiver. Turhin, though he was a brave boy with a man's heart, asked Jelif to hold his hand. She agreed without hesitation, for she too was as afraid as he was. Already in the company of these goblins I feels better than in such a sick, black hole. David suddenly burst out screaming, shaking from the cold. They are here. They look at us from the very beginning, Tirethadin said seriously. David was surprised and terrified. In that case, if they are here, why haven't they attacked us yet? He asked quietly. Probably because of the commander of Islisha who is here with us. It is better to be quiet so as not to arouse suspicion. Let's behave normally, replied the beautiful-haired, but he himself did not look normal at all. Like David and everyone else, he looked like a picture of misery and despair, and they walked as if they were half alive. Hearing this, however, David looked up and strained his eyes, wanting to see the monsters hiding there. Suddenly, he saw in the window of a house, on the 3rd floor, an outline of someone's silhouette. He said in his mind that it must be some worm or goblin, until he didn't saw the color of purple. Mirentagon is upstairs. David suddenly began to scream, who in an instant remembered everything. A memory appeared in his head again at the sight of the monster's smile. What? Where is he? Celian was horrified, grabbing the bow with trembling hands. David did not answer, but began to toss himself and turn in all directions, wanting to think that what he just saw was only a phantasma. He continued to thrash and fiddling his hands until he suddenly tripped over a protruding stone. He fell to the ground, and as soon as he looked up, he saw that he was in front of some narrow, dead-end alley in which some figure was hiding. It's him, he howled terrified, rising as soon as possible from the ground, but after a while he noticed that it was only Worma hiding in the darkness. The monster, seeing the suspicious behavior of the boy, jumped out of the shadows and threw himself at him. David deflected the first blow with the sword, and then called out to his friends. Help, the monsters are here. The boy did not have to wait long. His companions, who ran after him, emerged after a while from behind the wall next to him. Celian tightened the bow to the shot, seeing that another creature was jumping out of the dark alley. The scout shot the first monster, but as he was about to pull the weapon back to kill the second enemy, who was throwing himself at David, 2 other arrows crashed into the head of the monster. Celian and David noticed that the arrow feathers were purple in color and with blue shafts. Pfis, I think I associate these laughs from some foe, Bago said, recalling how he fled with Tirethadin through the field, from a masked archer. These are Jelifesa's shots, he said, then he slid out from behind the wall. The others did the same and saw the princess jumping off the windowsill upwards. The girl, dressed in a purple mantle with white sleeves, grabbed onto the quickly protruding wall below the barrier surrounding the balcony and jumped on it. She put her bow on her back, then stood out and exclaimed, I'm sorry I made you afraid. Can you take my arrows and go upstairs to me? Here you are seen like some kind of bait in the middle of the street. David sighed at the thought that he almost fainted, having seen the color of the princess's clothes beforehand. I thought you were Mirentagon, said the boy, towards Jelifesa. What? I can't hear anything. You'd better come here quickly to me, the girl called out. An overjoyed Jelif was the first to rush towards the entrance to the building, where her young friend was. Celian, on the other hand, pulled out the shafts of his arrows and 2 of the princess's arrows, and he was the last to pass through the demolished door, to the interior of the building. David stated that they were now in some shop on the ground floor, or rather its remains. The moonlight penetrated through the broken windows, illuminating the slightly stripped store shelves. Behind some of them they could see the dead bodies of goblins, probably killed earlier by Jelifesa. Tirethadin decided that it would be worth taking a few products that might be useful for something. All he took was a rope, box of matches, a cloth and a small notebook, and so there was nothing more than broken dishes and broken watches or other ornate old stuff. When he had finished, he followed his companions towards the stairs leading to the upper floors. The winding staircase was so dark that some of them inauspiciously tripped over more bodies of dead monsters. After a while, they finally managed to grope for the 2nd floor, where Jelifesa was waiting for them behind the door. Through a small window in a wooden passage, they could see the pale light of the lamp. illuminating her face. She opened the door for them, inviting them inside. "And where is Nanthornin and the others?" Terhin asked. "I'm alone here. Nanthornin told me to check how have you been. I will take you to the others by a safe route." And Jalafessa did not finish the sentence, because she suddenly noticed that behind the boy's back, there was an Isletian general in the shadow. She screamed at the sight of him, pulling out a bow in a flash. "What is this pirate doing here with you?" she asked. "How could I not notice him before? What is he doing here?" she still asked. "Well, he is with us, because he wants to get out of here," Tirethadin replied. "And do you know what trust like him ends up with? I have already told you about one such man, who instead my help, he wanted to rob me and he turned out to be a spy. All Elshians are like that," said the princess. "Maybe so, but maybe not," Tirethadin said. "I tell you, this robber will sooner or later betray you. I have no intention of being captured with you," said the girl. "Well, so what are we supposed to do with him? Kill him here?" David said. Hearing this, the princess sighed. "Okay, maybe he won't betray us, but I swear that as soon as he starts to do something strange, I'll be ready to shoot him," she replied. "Calm down, Jalif. After a while, we will finally find out what this man really is like," Jalif said. "Of course we will find out. We will only find out when this pirate delivers us over, straight into the hands of Mirentigan himself," said the archer. Hearing this, David decided to defend the Isletian at least a little from the princess's accusations. "Excuse me, can I say something to your majesty?" the boy began. The girl just nodded. "His name is Meddens and he wants to run away with us and, the boy suddenly fell silent and froze in stillness. We saw Mirentigan." Jelif finished for him, guessing what the boy meant. Meddens helped David defeat him and now he knows very well that it is not worth serving him, but Tirethadin also interrupted his speech. "Did you kill Mirentigan?" the princess asked incredulously. No one answered her question, but the girl noticed that suddenly all of the comrades began to stare strangely at the ground. Tirethadin stood still motionless, and after a while David began to howl. "This thing cannot be killed. This psycho wants to destroy us all." I pushed my sword right in his mouth, but he couldn't die. The devil wanted to get me. He was not human. Hearing this princess, she didn't know what to think. She sighed, and then said, "So it's worse than I thought. This guy really has to be more than just a crazy traitor. This fanatic rules these monsters as if he were one of them. I heard him shout something about the new better world and other similar fairy tales. This someone is a real incarnation of evil." He laughed right in my eyes as he stuck an arrow in his head. David began to scream, crying and trembling like jelly. "Quiet a little, goblins can still be here. We'd better all go inside and close the door behind us," the girl replied quietly but firmly. The team entered a dark room, illuminated only by the moonlight, piercing through the glazed doors of the balcony. Jalafessa closed the door behind them, then placed her lamp on the table to illuminate slightly the large room. "Curtain the windows," the girl recommended to them. Meddens didn't know Efinestian, but he figured out what was going on, so he and Celian covered the balcony door with old curtains. David began to look at the room and noticed that once this house must have been very beautiful. Next to the stove, covered with marble slabs, stood dusty, Oroi armchairs and an oak table. Above it hung a gilded chandelier, and on the wall next to it, there were large paintings and shelves for books. "The owner of this property must have liked very different book collections," he said, seeing that next to the shelves, there is also a whole pile of great books. He took the first of them and read the title. On the cover wrote, embroidered with a golden thread, to his surprise, Geographical Atlas. He did not expect to draw just such an interesting book, so he opened it out of curiosity, and various maps appeared to his eyes. On the first page, the boy saw a map of the entire unknown world. So they really believe here apparently in a flat earth. It was predictable, he noted. At the end of the sketched circle there was an inscription, the edge of the world, and right next to it, at the bottom, there was the nation of 4 countries. "Actually, Efinestia is very small," he said, seeing that it occupies on the map only as much as a small grain. However, David stopped looking at the maps for a moment, because he suddenly felt that he had to settle down in the toilet. "Surely there will be some throne here. After all, it's home," he said, then looked around. In front of the balcony there was a door. David approached them and opened them uncertainly, looking around the room. After a while, He decided that this was the place he was looking for and nothing threatened him here. A little light was getting through the small, glazed window, so the boy could sit quietly on the pisser and look through the book, only to forget about all the unpleasant bad things again for a moment. He left the door a little ajar to have more light, then he would get his pants off and begin to take care of his urgent need. There is nothing like browsing an atlas of an unknown world on a wooden throne, he said, smiling cheerfully, probably for the first time, in the last few days. When he was done and was about to pick up the toilet paper, he suddenly jumped up, scared. He had the impression that when his treasures had already fallen into the depths of the toilet, he heard a quiet moan downstairs. The boy swallowed his saliva, but a moment later he found that something had overheard him and maybe it was just the creaking of an unclosed door. So he wiped his bottom, put on his pants, and to make sure he looked carefully into the wooden wardrobe. In the darkness, only the edges of the round hole could be seen, so David decided that he would not see anything there anyway. The boy grabbed a handle to open the door, and as he did it, he suddenly heard someone's scream. "Look for them. Everyone is to look for the arsonists of the village. Mirantican wants to get them all alive. Seek for them all." The terrified boy ran into the main room without closing the door behind him. His companions, who were as surprised as he was, jumped out of their chairs, and Jalifessa ran to the balcony door, pulling the curtains back. Then she looked outside. A large horde of creatures appeared to her eyes, which after a while began to march along the road. From smaller streets and buildings also began to run wild monsters, which spread to all possible directions. At first there were not many of them, but after a while the goblins and the wormers began to pour out like a river on the right side of the main street. "Take your belongings quickly and run upstairs," shouted the girl, then moved away from the window and picked up the lamp from the table. David was about to approach his comrades, until suddenly the door of the balcony shattered, and through the curtains emerged the paws of grey-skinned monsters. One of them grabbed Mettens by the arm and tried to drag him onto the balcony. The monster emerged out from behind the curtain, trying to get through the crack in the broken door. "Human myths are here," the goblin started screaming, but after a while he fell silent when Jelif treated his oblong head with a frying pan. David looked at all this from the opposite direction, not believing, until suddenly, behind him, he heard a loud scream. He turned around surprised and saw through the ajar door that some hands were also emerging from the toilet. After a while, the first of the monsters emerged his head from the center of the hole, and then noticed the boy. David began to scream at the thought that the groans he had heard in the toilet before were real, and that a whole bunch of these disgusting beings were climbing toward his bare ass. The creature had a pointed nose, and on her bald head, the boy also noticed his own brown treasures. The monster smiled at him and jumped out of the middle of the hole. David, seeing that more creatures were coming out of the center of the hole, decided to act. At the last moment, he slammed the door, and the bald goblin bounced off it, with a waist, his long nose. David opened the door again, so the monster wanted to push himself inside, but he didn't know it was a trap. The boy crushed the goblin's fingers with a heavy oak door and reached for his sword. Immediately afterwards, he began to jab mercilessly through a narrow gap, but there were more and more monsters, and the boy had less and less strength. The monsters pushing across the door eventually broke into the main room, but David did not give up. After a while, several goblins were already pierced by his diuretic arrows. His comrades defending behind him had a much harder time, even though there were more of them. No wonder, since there were hundreds of these monsters down that were still climbing to the balcony. "There are too many of them, we have to run to the upstairs, quickly," the princess began to call them. Hearing this, the team rushed to escape towards the stairs. The princess slipped across the table and finally kicked one of the goblins right in the face. David froze in amazement, not knowing what had just happened to the attacking monster, which suddenly fell to the ground like a rag doll. After a while, however, he came to his consciousness and ran after the others towards the stairs. On the way, he noticed that the monsters also wanted to get through the main door they entered. Limping Mettens stayed at the dead last, climbing to the next floor. David had the impression that there must already be at least 100 goblins in the apartment, feeling the steps of the stairs under his feet begin to shake. So the boy turned around and saw that the entire door of the balcony had suddenly been raised to the ground. After a while, the monsters ran onto a large table, which by the force of the impact shot into the air, breaking the chandelier up. The whole room was showered with hundreds of monsters. Jalithessa was finally the first to reach the third floor, and she began to open the door with the key she had found earlier at the entrance to the house. Faster, David began to scream, seeing that the monsters were almost halfway up the stairs. "The door is stuck. You have to help me," shouted the princess, tugging at the handle. Celian began to fire with the bow, shooting at monsters running into them, but his arrows began to drain. Bago TWOU best leschool, TWOU best doctle, TWOU best desloyal, TWOU best thinkle, TWOU best linguist, Bagon TWOU best key expelled perhaps, Bago suddenly said, and then picked up the keys from Jalithessa. He stuck the key into the lock hole and began to twist it in different directions. Then he pushed the entrance with his body and began to ferret something in the lock. "Shake it," David continued to scream, helping Celian fire at the monsters that were just a few meters below. Fortunately, the swarm of these creatures turned out to be on the one hand, also a doom for the monsters, because the pushing monsters, climbing the upstairs took twice time as long. Meanwhile, Muddy was almost finished. After a while, the door slammed and suddenly opened, which literally made Bago fly inside, falling over on a dusty carpet. The others also began to run into the old bedroom. Wounded in the leg, Mettens, unfortunately fell over on the stairs, knocked down inadvertently by his comrades pushing inside. Jalithessa, holding the door, noticed a lying Asletion who was unable to get up. She knew very well that she had no more time, but she had no intention of looking out the door as the goblins tore apart a wounded pirate. "Even if this Asletion turns out to be an enemy, I'd rather kill him myself," she thought, then ran up the stairs and picked Mettens up from the ground. The goblins were so close that one of them ripped off the pirate's robe from his shoulders. The princess literally threw the wounded man inside, who fell directly on Bago, and then she closed the door behind her at the last moment. An Asletion joined the Arsonists. "Traitor, open to us the door, human curs," one of the monsters began to squeal. However, the team had no intention of doing so. "Barricade the entrance," Jalithessa shouted, pushing against the door. Bago grabbed a large wardrobe, but even as strong Muddy as he was, could not lift it, especially since his injured arm was not doing its best. Celian grabbed a large piece of furniture from the other side and they both began to push it towards the vibrating door. "It won't stand up right away, help me," cried the princess to Turhin, Tirefadin and David. Hearing this, the three comrades pushed for the entrance, which after a while was massacred by goblins' heavy axes, adapted for such purposes. Heavy tools, in just a few moments left gaps in the outdated wood. Fortunately, Bago and Celian finally reached the place and barricaded the entrance with a large piece of furniture, putting it horizontally on the side, so that it would be harder for the goblins to knock it over. Jelif, who had just lifted Mettens from the ground, said, however, that it was better not to risk and that the barricade should be strengthened. "Let's move the bed," the woman recommended. The team, seeing the wardrobe shaking, decided it was right and necessary. The double bed turned out to be incredibly heavy, of course, so all together, 8 people, lifted it up and began to pull it towards the makeshift but salutary barricade. After a while, 8 breathless escapees managed to push another piece of furniture to the target and put it in front of the closet. Now the barricade had no way to even move, because the bed was so attached to it that it could not be pushed further. "Now I don't think they will come in here," Turhin said. "Only until the time," said the princess. Then she ran to the wall next to it and picked up a long, hooked wire from the ground. After a while, she lifted it towards the wooden hatch upstairs leading to the attic. She aimed at the wire with the key at the very tip and twisted the lock, then pulled the hooked end. The entrance opened with a bang, and then it was enough to pull out a folding ladder from the ceiling so that they could enter the attic. "Come in, upstairs, I found a safe way to the other friends. We better not waste time," the girl said, and then climbed first into the attic. "Yes, let's go now," David replied, glancing diagonally at the barricade shaking again. After a while, everyone began to climb upstairs in a hurry. Tirefadin helped the last Mettens overcome the last few steps, after which Jalithessa hid the ladder back and closed the hatch properly. "For now, we are rather safe, but where is your route?" David asked the princess. Hearing this, the girl pointed to one of the broken windows, which could get to the roof of the building. "This is where I got here. I've researched where the guard sentries on the roofs are, so you can trust me. There is only one greater obstacle on the way, but I managed to put a footbridge there. so it will not be hard for you." When she said this, she jumped nimbly out of the window onto the sloping roof, and then jumped to the top of the second house. Her companions did the same, and for the time being it was not really visible that the route was to be difficult to overcome. In some places you only had to jump down or climb low elevation, so even for the older Jelif, such a small climb was not too difficult. In fact, Mettens had worse with his leg, but all he had to do was grabbing his hand so that he could climb some obstacles. David felt like a Peter Parker playing on the rooftops, but it wasn't funny at all. Even on such a straight route, he had to run carefully, and there could be some danger lurking on every side. Downstairs, on the main street, they could still hear the screams of the wormers and goblins. Suddenly, David's foot slipped unexpectedly off from the tile, and the boy fell over and began to slide down the roof. Fortunately, nothing happened to him and he landed a meter lower, to the next top of the building. Chapter 35. Jalifessa stayed at the edge of the roof and told her companions to stop. "Here you have to be careful. I put a footbridge over this hole so that you would not accidentally fall. From this height, you can undoubtedly easily break your neck and die." When she said this, she jumped on a small bridge and got to the other side. The next one entered carefully. "Jelif, do not be afraid, grab my hand," said the princess to her friend, helping her to overcome her last few steps, which led to safety place. When the woman finally reached Jalifessa, Mettens entered the footbridge with Derefadin, who had to belay the pirate, who found it difficult to keep his balance with one leg. Despite this, they went quite quickly, but Derefadin was worried, because he had the impression that when he was crossing the footbridge, one of the boards was creasing dangerously. He turned around and saw that Bago was already passing on the small bridge. "I guess I'm a bit heavy," said Muddy, also feeling this unpleasant creaking under him, but fortunately he also reached his destination safely. "Careful," Bago called out to Celian, who was entering after him, who had tentatively barely entered the footbridge to make sure that something was really wrong. He also heard an unpleasant noise, so he decided that it would be best to overcome the obstacle as soon as possible by running through it. He ran onto the boards, until suddenly, when he was already halfway there, the middle board suddenly broke. The scout stopped, feeling an unpleasant feeling under his feet. Suddenly, the young man jumped, but just then the footbridge collapsed when he bounced off it, which made him do it a bit clumsily. Fortunately, Bago and Derefadin caught a companion who had been clinging to the edge of the roof for a while, just with the tips of his shoes. If it weren't for his friends, he probably wouldn't have been able to regain his balance and he would have died falling into a dark alley downstairs. On the other side, only David and Turhan remained. Two boys breathed a sigh of relief at the thought that their comrades were fine, but they also broke down from the fact that the footbridge had to fail. Turhan, however, knew how to climb best, so he jumped without hesitation. Unfortunately, he was too low to overcome the 4-meter distance, but he was well aware of it. The 10-year-old boy jumped, grabbing his hands by the gutter. David gritted his teeth when he saw that the gutter might not withstand his weight, but the boy pulled himself up a bit and his friends dragged him upstairs. Jelif embraced him and then looked toward David, who remained at the very end. The boy looked down uncertainly, but finally he remembered that he had already jumped over larger obstacles. The teenager took as much run as possible to be sure that he will overcome the distance, then bounced off the ground and jumped the hole without any problems. Weight off Jalifessa's mind, seeing that nothing had happened to anyone. "Sorry, I didn't foresee it." "Never mind, after all you have already saved our asses several times," Celian replied with a smile. Turhan grimaced to hear this strange term, which should be not pronounced in front of the king's daughter. The archer, however, reciprocated the scout's smile and then announced, "So let's move on. The night is about to end, and this is not a good sign at all in our current situation." Stating that, she jumped on the sloping roof and started sliding down on it. The others did the same after a while and they began to run further on the tops of high houses. Suddenly, however, after about a dozen or so minutes of tiring jumping, the team stopped in front of another obstacle and looked with reproach at their guide. "You have already said that this is the end of such holes." David was outraged, seeing also that it was impossible to even jump over it, because the hole was between them and the high building. So there was a big wall in front of them, under which was another, dark pit. "Don't blame me, just follow me, trust me," the princess replied in a calm tone, and to their amazement and horror, the girls simply jumped into a narrow alley. Celian ran to the edge of the roof and looked down. Unfortunately, He could not see anything through the night darkness and did not know what was down. "Your Majesty, are you okay?" worried a scout, not hearing for a long time that the girl was talking. "Yes, of course I am fine. After all, I told you to follow me. What are you doing up there?" the girl downstairs finally said, embarrassed. Celine mumbled something vaguely, not knowing what to think about it. "I'd rather not do that, princess," the young man called out towards the dark hole. "And vhy, you sate fat apparently at home lie out jump at flom tfe balcony," Bago said, approaching the scout. "Well, yes, but I usually jumped into a river or a haystack, not into some ag," shouted at the very end Celine, because the mudman pushed him unexpectedly with his long paw from the roof. The scout began to scream, seeing that he was falling into a dark alley, at least 25 meters down. He was already convinced that he would die until his legs did not suddenly break into the straw roof, which literally collapsed like a house of cards, and he himself did not fall on something pleasantly soft. Only his head hurt after this unexpected shock, but he did not pay any attention to it. "Oh, haystack," he noticed with amusement, until suddenly he screamed in fear. He saw that right next to him, all the hay was suddenly scattered all around him, as if a firecracker had hit it. After a while, however, the head of the muddy came out of the stack. Bago spat out pieces of dry grass from his mouth and then he looked at his companion with a sincere jagged smile. "What do you even imagine? Did you want to kill me? At first you threw me into that hole, and then you almost fell on my back, breaking my spine." Celine was angry. Hearing this, Bago answered nothing, but continued to stare at him with his teeth gripped, the scout's eyes rolling over on his side, until he suddenly froze again in terror as he began to roll down from a mighty pile of hay. Everything began to spin before his eyes, and then he suddenly fell with a wailing to the very bottom, straight to the hard paved ground. Suddenly, someone grabbed him by the arm and put him on his feet. The young man was relieved to see Jellyfess's face in front of him. "Not a bad landing?" she asked. "It could have been your mage." The scout again did not finish the sentence, hearing another bang behind him. When he heard a young laughter, he immediately guessed who jumped off next. Turhin and Bago came down to them, after a while, and began to laugh at the scout, seeing his still terrified eyes. "Stop now, I just didn't know what might be at the bottom," and he stopped again jumping, seeing that another person was banging into the haystack. His companions laughed again at the sight of his face, but after a while they fell silent when they heard Tirefidin's voice. "Help, I can't get out of here." Beautiful-haired man, immersed to his shoulders in the dense, dry grass, he tried to free his hands so that he could dig out the rest of his body, which, because of the influence of speed, literally thrashed him inside. Fortunately, a screaming David jumped right after him. When the boy hit the soft ground like a bomb, the screams died down, turning as if into a squeal, and from under the wafting dust, his painful face emerged. "Help me, David," Tirefidin cried, drilling his head in all possible directions. When the boy finally came to his consciousness and recovered from the sudden shock, he grabbed the man by the shoulders and began to pull him up. "Just a little more," said the green-eyed man, finally feeling that he had his hands on top. After a while, however, a metal thing hit David's head. The boy whined in pain, grabbing his head, and after a while he noticed that this thing was Metten's helmet. He turned backwards and saw Jelly flying down and the pirate's legs sticking out of the haystack. The boy rushed in that direction, collapsing into soft hay every now and then, but fortunately it turned out that Mettens did not have his head sunk in the grass, but he only lay on his back with a stiffened, injured leg, which he lifted up. So the boy returned to the fidgeting Tirefidin and began to dig him up again. "Well, Jellyfessa went crazy a bit," Jellyf said after a while, seeing the place where she had just found herself, and then she went downstairs to her friend. Immediately behind her came the others, and now they were all finally on ordinary, hard ground. David, with a stagger in his steps, finally sat down and asked the princess, "Since we're already at the bottom, are the others waiting nearby?" "Yes, we can get out of here," the princess replied, and then she was the first to move towards the closed gate opposite. She opened the large wooden door a bit and looked out carefully. In front of her was a large crowd of unhappy people, probably serving as slaves in their former capital. Everyone was turned to her with their heads down and lined up in an even line. "We have to leave, they should probably still be here," Jellyfessa said, and just as she was about to leave, some creature suddenly jumped out of the door, Surprised, the girl did not have time to pull out her weapon and she fell on the stony ground. Celian pulled out a bow as soon as possible, seeing the princess in danger, but after a while Worma with an axe in his hand was unexpectedly beheaded by someone. The rest of the body fell limply to the ground, revealing a mysterious individual standing in the shadows. After a while, the entering man came closer, revealing his face from the shadow. David frowned, seeing a strangely familiar person. Nan Thornin, what did you dress in? The boy roared suddenly. I didn't dress in anything, I just stripped down. He was corrected by a warrior, dressed in a white shirt with wide sleeves. It would not be surprising if the clothes did not look for a boy, as if a little too womanish, at least on this muscular body of Nant. David wanted to say something else, but after a while, the rest of his friends stepped in. Finally there you are, we have been waiting for you for a long time, Papin rejoiced. However, the boy did not pay attention to what the halfling just said. He was staring at his goblin helmet, which covered his entire face, and also his black chainmail. Can you explain this to me logically? David finally mumbled. I told you, David, clearly in a dream that we cannot arouse suspicion, Nan Thornin replied, leaning across his long sword. In what dream? So David was telling us the truth? Celian was surprised. Hearing this, Nan Thornin raised one eyebrow, as if pretending that it was not surprising at all. I think you know, Celian, that Nan Thornin is mysterious to say the least. After all, he can change his skin. Cordrin laughed, dressed in some decorated green tunic. I don't want to disturb, but I also have a question, rather much more interesting, Nethin said suddenly. Well, what's going on? Celian asked. What is this supposed to mean? The young man finally asked, pointing to the Ashletian. Yes, this is someone, Celian said, embarrassed. Nethin burst out laughing, and he said that he was so afraid of these pirates. Boo-ha-ha, and now one of them is standing right behind him. Celian mumbled something pointless again, and then sighed. But seriously, what is he doing here? I guess it's not for nothing that he's here with you, Harin said. Well, Celian, haven't you killed him yet? Nethin laughed. Do you think this is the right time for such stupid jokes? Nan Thornin scolded him. The young man immediately fell silent. The warrior rose from the ground, then hid his sword under his arm. Let David tell us better what this Ashletian is doing with them. Rather, he should explain it best to us, he said again. Everyone looked at the fair-haired boy, waiting for his answers. David, however, stood in silence, staring at the ground. Tirethidin was the first to guess why the boy behaved like this. Again he remembered a masked ruler who wanted to destroy them. I know you met him, Nan Thornin said suddenly. Hearing this, David shoved his eyes forward, and Celian fell over in shock. What? David screamed. I knew that he would come for us, the warrior repeated more accurately. Wait, was it with you too? Tirethidin asked. We didn't meet him, but we did saw him, replied the giant. How's that? What are you even talking about now? I didn't see and saw anything, began to scream surprised Nethin. But I saw. The warrior replied, smiling at the young man. And you still have to laugh. This psycho is a real embodiment of evil. He cannot be killed, David finally said, indignant at his friend's behavior. As for Mirentagun, I'm not laughing, David. Now I'm laughing only at himself, replied the warrior. What are you talking about now? The boy mumbled. I laughed at myself because it was through me that Mirentagun learned that we were already here, David, Nan Thornin finally explained, as calmly as he could. Hearing this, however, David involuntarily began to throw himself in a frenzy. What, are you laughing at this thing? This is pathetic, howled the boy. I didn't do it specifically, I knew Mirentagun was going to be waiting for us, and that's why I told you to separate, the giant replied. To leave me alone, right in front of the nose of this feral fanatic, roared a broken David. Of course not, if I had gone with you, Mirentagun would have killed you right away. I had to leave you, replied the warrior. He wanted to kill me anyway. I saw better than you what this psycho wanted to do with us, the boy howled again. Not David. If I had been with you then, he would have killed me, and consequently, you would not have been able to return to your home. Mirentagun will never kill you, and I will live, because his goal is not to take away your life, but your mind. You are a great danger to him, but I am a problem for him and he will not kill you anyway. because it would not make sense. Nanthornin said, "Wait. I'm not raving about anything again. Can you speak a little slower? I mean to say, David, that if he had just killed you like that, you would have only returned to your world." The giant replied loudly, straight to the boy's face. "Nanthornin, do you feel good? What kind of world do you mean again?" Jalithessa was surprised. "Don't you think, Princess, that David comes from here?" Nathan asked her. "Yes, but this other world is just a fairy tale. It doesn't exist at all. These are just legends," the girl claimed. "Oh, how good it is to hear in the end someone who, like me, has no idea what is going on here," David rejoiced. "Maybe you can tell me, Nanthornin, that this whole world is just one big schizophrenia. I am sorry, but that's how I am starting to feel, but maybe there's a chance I'll just wake up." David still laughed sarcastically. "I see that both of you are probably very tired. I guess you should rest," said Jalithessa, seeing the strange behavior of her comrades. "Or maybe Mirentigan is just a nightmare. This whole theater is just starting to overwhelm me. I'm sorry, Nanthornin. I'm about to faint," spoke still like a doll, David. The princess grimaced. Then she saw how the boy began to laugh weakly, and after a while he hit his head on the beam protruding from the ceiling. He fell over, but there was no indication that anything had happened to him. After a while, however, the boy began to fiddling and squirming on the ground like crazy. Nanthornin picked up the lying boy from the ground and then put him on the ground. "Come to your senses, David. Pull yourself together and behave normally," cried the giant. "Or there, I just need to rest. I'm a little weak and that's it. Oh, I guess I am about to fly away."